Hello everyone, again. We've not long been together, but now we're back. I don't propose to add to the praying we've already done because there's been a lot of it, and that's the best preparation for further thought about this topic, I think, going to Mass. So, this course is going to be 5 Sundays, not as originally intended 4, and the first talk, which is a little longer than the others, I think, is very much laying the ground for consideration of the 4 pillars of the quadrilateral. But there's a bit of history and a bit of theology to look at to try and get us to that point. So this is very much introductory. Welcome to those who are online as well, I should say. There will be some people watching us live, and there are others who will be watching us later, because this is both streamed and recorded. In particular, some friends that we picked up in 2023 at these talks in Honolulu, wonderfully, St. Mark's Church in a place I don't think I can pronounce correctly in Honolulu, which is a church of exactly our tradition. I looked at their website. It's a beautiful church and should be one of our sister churches. We should see if we can form a link, I think, with St. Mark's. Okay. It's not an exaggeration to suggest that there is in our day a battle being fought for the soul of Anglicanism. The arguments, of course, have been going on throughout our Anglican history, but they've sharpened in my lifetime, certainly. Christianity, it used to be taken for granted, did not exist without the Church, but many Anglicans even tend, in my experience now, to take the form of the Church for granted in a bad or negligent sense, even to dismiss the history and detail as irrelevant. I would suggest that some of our present difficulties arise from lack of attention to this detail by most members of the Church of England and wider Anglicanism, as we've become preoccupied with what I would say are second-order issues, getting carried away by perhaps every new thing or sitting lethargically where we were. And that's my reason for taking our church itself as a subject and wanting to attend to the importance of the Catholic heart of our church. What we do and teach in a church like ours, shouts our commitment to common ground with the undoubted Catholic Church in communion with the Holy Father. But since the late 19th century, when Pope Leo XIII ill-advisedly declared Anglican orders invalid, if we claim to be Catholics, as we do, it is necessary to create a credible account of our history and our present, an account which shows that St. Jude's Carlton is also part of the one Catholic and Apostolic Church which we proclaim in the Creed. What St. Jude's and churches like it do and teach are making that harder, in some ways, to make the claim than it used to be. But that does not mean, I would say, that we should or even can abandon our claim to be Catholic. Outside of England, there's the additional question of why we exist at all, given that we know our origins are essentially bound up with chaplaincy to colonial regimes, rather than being just the national church, as the Church of England claimed to be. So, while I shall be talking about sacramental theology and liturgy, I need to begin with how we got here and how that affects who we now are. Short interlude of a story. Some years ago in Arizona, I met 2 keen Christians, active members of a large Baptist church, who were seeking to minister to some of the prisoners on death row nearby in Florence, Arizona. Sean's motivation was that he had formerly been in maximum security prison himself. He was a biker and described himself as not Trinitarian, which sometimes caused him to argue with his Baptist pastor. His wife was from a more orthodox Baptist stable who'd lived and worshipped in London when she was young. They asked me what I did, and I tried to explain. It turned out they had never heard of Anglicanism or of the Episcopal Church of the United States. They wondered what the Church of England might be. Was it Catholic or Protestant? Yes, I answered. Yes, because we are both Catholic and Reformed. And yes, because the question is as important as the answer, I think. It's fashionable today to decry what is sometimes called denominationalism. We are to be Christians, not members of a denomination. What is often forgotten is that the Church of England, and therefore Anglicanism, is not and was never intended to be a denomination. Our claim to authenticity as the Church of God does not rest on a confessional document like the Presbyterian Westminster Confession, or the dogmatic assent to particular doctrines like penal substitutionary atonement, biblical inerrancy, transubstantiation, or papal infallibility. In England, the claim is the simplest claim of all, that we continue to be the Church as first established in England during the Roman occupation, revived and strengthened by St. Augustine of Canterbury's mission. The Church in Wales, where I was a curate, part of the Church of England until disestablishment in Wales in 1920, the Church in Wales would say that since St. Augustine's mission was repelled at the River Severn, hence the place name Ost there, her credentials are uninterrupted from the earliest preaching of the gospel in what is now the United Kingdom. The first question we have to return to is this: was the Church of England merely the fruit of Henry VIII's dubious marital history, as Roman Catholic apologists have often claimed? There was a political separation of England and her church from Rome at that time. It was considerably more complicated in its origins even than Henry's personal life. But there'd been an extremely significant precursor to that separation, of course. Constantinople and Rome had separated, again politically, in fact, several centuries earlier, and both claimed to be the one true church, the whole Catholic Church without remainder, as it is sometimes put. The claim of the Church of England was always more modest than that, simply that she was the church in that land. That's to say, the claim of the Church of England was not exclusive of claims held outside England. The Catholic Church was held to exist elsewhere under the governance of Rome or Constantinople. In England, however, all other claims were said to be superseded by the local church. What other parameters beyond this very simple claim can be identified for our church, which, as you can immediately intuit, has implications for Anglicans outside England? Appeal is often made to the 39 Articles of Religion and the Book of Common Prayer. The truth is that the 39 Articles are a time-bound formulary hardly known by most Anglicans, and the Book of Common Prayer has passed out of common use. These were significant documents during and after the long process of separation. Although the separation happened swiftly, these documents remained works in progress for a very long time. You'll know that the productions of the Book of Common Prayer in several editions range from 1549 to 1662, after the Commonwealth. Therefore, to say, as people sometimes still do, that we define ourselves by a prayer book, by commonality in worship, rather than a body of canon law or doctrinal confession, is disingenuous, now that we don't actually worship in the same way or from the same book from one parish to the next. Although there may once have been more uniformity than we now experience, it was never, in fact, as simple as that, if you read your church history of the Church of England anyway. And the attempts of some to find a solution to what they regard as a lack of Anglican rigour based on common liturgy and practice would lead us, as Mark Chapman has written, to a frightening vision of a church controlled by the Liturgical Commission. So, to thinking about the Anglican Communion. The second related question, which has a sharp edge for us in Australia or anywhere outside England. What is Anglicanism as a world phenomenon? Wider Anglicanism is in origin, of course, we must admit, a colonial development. It grew into what we would now call a denomination or separate church in most countries of the world, out of its role as a chaplaincy to English people overseas in the Empire and beyond. But one important caveat needs to be added. Scottish Anglicanism is different in origin and type from English Anglicanism. Not being an established church in Scotland, it had an urgent need to define itself. And Scottish Anglicanism, the Scottish Episcopal Church, to give it its proper name, produced the Episcopal Church in the United States of America, when the Church of England would not consecrate Samuel Seabury as the first bishop of the Episcopal Church in the USA. So, as the name of that church indicates, bishops are essential to its self-definition. So the claims of Anglicanism outside England are different and possibly more tenuous than the claims of the Church of England. While it may be easy to claim the Church of England as a national church, rather as the Orthodox churches are independent, or as they would say, autocephalous national churches, it is more difficult to justify the position of Anglicanism in, say, this country of Australia. Here, Anglicanism has never been an established church, and the claims of the Roman Church are undoubtedly very strong, a large proportion of the population being of Irish Catholic descent or having arrived from other Catholic countries, and the Roman Church having an obvious claim to being a, or they might say the, international communion. In Australia, as in most of the world, Anglicanism is now simply a denomination, regarded by the state as a form of Christianity on an equal footing with Presbyterianism, Seventh-day Adventism, even Mormonism. Should it exist at all outside of England? And if it should, there must surely be some specific markers to help us identify what it is, who we are. These have been developing really for a bit over a century and a half, and now necessarily have an impact on the Church of England itself as well as on us. So, would we look for doctrinal markers? Would, for example, we look, as in Calvinism or its offspring Scottish Presbyterianism, for confessional statements? Well, to return to the Church of England, it is accurately observed that the Church of England has no distinctive doctrines, because continuity rather than change is the key to who we are. And that's why we are properly described as Reformed rather than Protestant. Protestants are definitively Christians who took stands on doctrinal points of difference and protested. My father, an evangelical Anglican for most of his life, always insisted that he was not protesting about anything by his particular Christian allegiance. Characteristically, we also have fewer doctrines upon which we insist, anyway, than several sister churches, including our immediate Roman parent. The theological route taken by our reformers was minimalist. It was an attempt to find the core of what must be taught and believed, and then to allow for difference in those things which could be said to be indifferent, the adiaphora. The clearest window I've found to understanding Anglicanism, both in England and abroad, in this context, is a line of thought first developed by the 19th century Anglican theologian F.D. Maurice, elaborated by Michael Ramsey, especially in his famous book, The Gospel and the Catholic Church, and more recently by Bishop Rowan Williams. Maurice expressed it like this, and it's the first of the three things on your handout. Our church has no right to call herself better than other churches in any respect. In many, she must acknowledge herself to be worse. But our position, we may fairly affirm, for it is not a boast but a confession, is one of singular advantage. Our faith is not formed by a union of Protestant systems with the Romish system, nor of certain elements taken from the one and of certain elements taken from the others. So far as it is represented in our liturgy and our articles, it is the faith of a church that has nothing to do with any system at all. That peculiar character which God gives us enables us, if we do not slight the mercy, to understand the difference between a church and a system. I think that's very beautifully put. And now some thoughts about bishops. If we are a church without, or rather than, a system, especially in the sense of a systematic theology of the Thomist kind, how to find our parameters, however widely drawn they may be. Even the minimal theological positions which have been preserved and handed on in our church have tended to be implicit rather than defined. There have been very occasional doctrinal arguments in the Church of England, such as that in the 19th century over baptismal regeneration, which caused theological dissent and even changes of allegiance. But one issue has always turned conflict into crisis: bishops. The upheavals of the Commonwealth, when of course bishops were removed from the Christianity of England, and then later the period of the non-juring bishops in the reign of William and Mary, those bishops who wouldn't swear allegiance to a new monarch because the monarch to whom they'd sworn allegiance was still living. These were theological precursors of the arguments which turned Tractarians into Anglo-Catholics. Who should appoint bishops, the state or the church, was the effective topic of John Keeble's assize sermon on national apostasy, preached on the 14th of July 1833, which is held to signal the beginning of the Oxford movement. More recent arguments over the gender and sexuality of bishops, for example, are the same topic being played out with different points of detail to the fore. And we have, of course, in England the sadness of alternative oversight under different bishops for different parts of the Church of England now. Who can be a bishop and who chooses bishops are clearly then questions at the heart of who we are. Where does their significance to the being, what is called the essay of the Church, originate? And again, how are they essential to the Church's Catholic heart? The first attempt to pin down the core theological being or essay of Anglicanism as a larger phenomenon than the Church of England was also prompted by a question about who could be a bishop. To make sense of this, though, we need to go back a little and consider briefly the function of councils, sometimes called general councils, in the history of the whole Church. Councils can be traced back to Acts 15, to what is often called the Council of Jerusalem, when the apostles adjudicated the argument between Paul and Peter about whether Gentile Christian converts must keep the whole Jewish law. You'll recall that the whole of Paul's gospel mission turned on this question. There's a sense in which the answer to it creates Christianity and the Church as we now know it. Paul was vindicated, and Christianity left behind the distinctive Jewish markers of circumcision, food laws, and Sabbath observance. Being heirs of Abraham and children of God was now achieved by faith in Jesus Christ, not legal observance or physical descent. This was agreed by a council of church leaders, apostles, the leaders we would now call bishops. Following on this, from the earliest time of which we have information about the workings of church order, probably 3rd century, the bishops met with apostolic authority to settle disputes in the church. So, for example, when Christians under persecution abandoned their faith to save their lives, and then afterwards repented and sought readmission to the church, some bishops were severe while others were forgiving. It was necessary to find a common policy. There were many other such issues to resolve. When the Roman Empire affirmed Christianity, it was possible for councils to convene representing the whole church. These great councils, especially those of Nicaea and Chalcedon, won a permanent place in the history of the church by settling the contents of the canon of Scripture, importantly, also the creeds, and the right way to express the doctrines of God. 3 persons, one God, the Trinity, the doctrine of Christ, 2 natures, divine and human, and how to understand their subsistence in one person. Once these things were settled, more or less, the church and the scriptures that we recognize emerged. But these councils did not only leave a structure of Christian doctrine, they left a memory and a precedent that the right way to settle the affairs of the church is by meetings of bishops, that is, by people of apostolic authority who are the representatives of God to their flocks and of their flocks to God. Until and throughout the Middle Ages, this was held to be axiomatic, but in practice it became less true. First, sovereigns who saw that decisions by a council of bishops could affect the laws of the land wanted to establish some kind of control. Second, the growth in the Pope's power and in the effectiveness of his rulings undermined the role of councils, if Rome could decide what need was there of councils. Surely it would save the trouble and expense of long journeys away from the bishop's diocese if the Pope could just adjudicate. But by the end of the 14th century, the Pope's system had gone wrong. There were rival popes. The ills of the church were incurable by Rome, and a great movement arose to heal the church by means of councils, known as the conciliar movement. And these councils did not only consist of bishops. The theologians were there, and the representatives of sovereigns, or even the sovereigns themselves, and some priests were there to help their bishops. These councils did not succeed, however, in healing the ills of the church. Therefore, perhaps, we might say, came the Reformation and the division of Western Christendom. At first, Protestants had very little use for bishops. That did not mean that the idea of a council was dead. All agreed that the greatest dispute in church history could only be settled by a truly representative council. But when was a council truly representative? The Roman Church, of course, responded to the Reformation by convening the Council of Trent, which sat on and off from 1545 to 1563, but the deliberations of that were not acknowledged by any of the reformers, and that issued in the Counter-Reformation and a considerable strengthening and centralizing of papal control over the Roman Church. From the end of the Council of Trent, the notion that a council could heal the ills of Christian Europe was in suspense. However, in the second half of the 19th century, something new happened, or maybe something old happened again. The First Lambeth Conference and the First Vatican Council gathered almost at the same time, fascinatingly. It was an interesting moment in Christian history. The 19th century, of course, had so many other things about it which changed who we all are as human beings. Since the early 1860s, Pope Pius IX, trying to hold his corner against the new political unit called Italy, had been thinking about calling a council, and that would eventually be Vatican I, which gave him the ultimate power that he felt he needed, papal infallibility. Pius needed, in the Italian political landscape of his day, to assert the doctrinal power of the papacy. Relations with other churches had broken down to the extent that they were not considered relevant to such a gathering. Meanwhile, a small Anglican crisis was developing in Africa. Bishop Gray of Cape Town was establishing himself as metropolitan, that is, archbishop with oversight of a province, South Africa. There was a newly consecrated bishop in his province, Bishop Colenso of Natal. Colenso was a talented mathematician who had used his mathematics to disprove some numerical details of the Old Testament, which was worrying some people. He was also relaxed about local customs, such as polygamy. He questioned, for example, the morality of the Old Testament patriarchs, in whose lives, he noted, polygamy was sanctioned. All his positions would now seem unexceptionable, I think. Gray should undoubtedly have left him alone. Instead, he deposed and excommunicated Colenso. However, the secular courts in South Africa then declared the deposition illegal. Gray now needed a council of bishops to tell the lawyers that they had no jurisdiction to determine who was a bishop in South Africa, an old question rearing its head again. Rather, as in the larger world, Pius IX needed a council to tell Italian politicians to leave the church alone. Gray also wanted an authoritative statement of doctrinal boundaries for Anglicanism because he saw these things as bound up with the problem he had with Colenso, as did the Canadian bishops who were anxiously watching South Africa from a distance. This is probably beginning to sound a bit familiar. The practical question took a pointed form. Should Gray consecrate a new bishop for Natal? If he had rightly deposed Colenso, he should. If wrongly, he should not. And from this now forgotten argument came the First Lambeth Conference. It won't surprise you to learn it didn't solve the argument. However, we come to Lambeth I, which happened in 1867. It was a tremendously contentious thing. Some colonial bishops now petitioned Archbishop Longley of Canterbury for a forum in which they could resolve this question. The Archbishop of York, no less, and also the Bishop of Durham refused to have anything to do with such a gathering, fearing, they said, that it would lead to, quotes, too much doctrine and too much law. The 39 articles indicated that general councils may not be gathered together without the commandment and will of princes, Article 21. So this could not be a council, therefore, nor could it be a synod, an ancient form of episcopal government not yet reinvented in the Westminster parliamentary style we now enjoy in Anglicanism. And so they called it a conference. And it became a conference which repeatedly insisted, as it kept meeting over decades, that it had no binding authority, while simultaneously developing a large body of resolutions to which Anglicans began to refer as if they did have authority. It was as if, though not actually a clearly developed theme of law, these resolutions became a sort of Anglican background noise. Then Lambeth III, 1888, which is pivotal to what we're thinking about this Lent. Despite all this caution, the third conference in 1888, which was more fully attended, formulated a core Anglican definition of the marks of the Church. The concept of marks of the Church derives from the Reformers' Notae Ecclesiae, marks, as they thought about how to identify the Church apart from the Roman Communion. It's interestingly, this idea of marks of the Church is now taken up in Roman Catholic theology as well. These notae, or marks, finally identified 3 centuries after the break with Rome, became what we know as the Lambeth Quadrilateral. The quadrilateral was developed and adapted from a statement known as the Chicago Quadrilateral of the previous year, which had been formulated by the General Convention of the Episcopal Church of the United States. Thus, that strand of Anglicanism which had been exported to America, carrying as baggage the arguments of Scottish Anglicans with their Presbyterian establishment, was firmly reintegrated into the Anglican self-understanding. This ensured that episcopacy, crucial to the argument in Scotland, once again determined what it meant to be Anglican. This declaration of Lambeth III was conceived as a statement of terms for reunion with other Christians from both sides of the Catholic-Protestant divide. It was intentionally ecumenical in that it recognized, necessarily because of the international and colonial context, that there were now other denominations to be acknowledged. This was not just one local church arguing with an older parent. It was also an attempt to discover the core of the church that reaches beyond the fragmentation of denominationalism to establish the marks of the truly Catholic Church. That's what they were after. I've printed on your handout the 4 core elements of the Lambeth Quadrilateral, and I'll just read them out. The Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments as containing all things necessary to salvation and as being the rule and ultimate standard of faith. The Apostles' Creed as the baptismal symbol, and the Nicene Creed as the sufficient statement of the Christian faith. The 2 sacraments ordained by Christ himself, baptism and the Supper of the Lord, ministered with the unfailing use of Christ's words of institution and of the elements ordained by him. That's important. The historic episcopate, locally adapted in the methods of its administration to the varying needs of the nations and peoples called of God into the unity of his church. In summary, then, Holy Scriptures as a sufficient rule of faith, the 2 creeds, the 2 sacraments instituted by Christ, the historic episcopate, but the detail will prove to be important. Additionally, the 7th Lambeth Conference of 1930 defined the Anglican Communion in Resolution 49, which I've also given you. The Anglican Communion is a fellowship within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of those duly constituted dioceses, provinces, or regional churches in communion with the See of Canterbury, which have the following characteristics in common. They uphold and propagate the Catholic and Apostolic faith and order, as they are generally set forth in the Book of Common Prayer, as authorized in their several churches. They are particular or national churches, and as such promote within each of their territories a national expression of Christian faith, life and worship, and they are bound together not by a central legislative and executive authority, but by mutual loyalty, sustained through the common council of the bishops in conference. Within this statement can be identified the oft-quoted threefold foundation of our Anglican tradition: Scripture, tradition, and reason. The uniqueness and sufficiency of the Bible, Scripture, the authority of the early church in understanding the Bible, tradition, the value of the study of the Bible in each generation, whether by further study or new insights into its truth and its implications, reason. That resolution of 1930 suggests several aspects of the Anglican Communion which are worth underlining, some of which I have put into bold there. First, the word itself, which I haven't put in bold, but it is a communion, by which designation it locates itself firmly within the New Testament understanding of the Church, the early Church construct of koinonia, communion, fellowship, which underlies all sacramental and ecclesiastical theology. It's the reason why, as I was saying 2 years ago, I believe, that the Eucharist makes the Church. There's a good deal more to be said about communion. Second, it says very clearly that Anglicanism belongs to the one Catholic and Apostolic Church. Its ecclesiology is founded on the principle that there is more than one church that is Catholic, and that the existence of the Anglican Communion is far from being a negation of the creedal doctrine of the unity, Catholicity, and apostolicity of the Church, is in fact an example of it. There are churches that are non-Roman and are Catholic, and we are among them. Third, the faith and order of the Anglican Communion are held to be those that are characteristic of the Catholic and Apostolic Church, as they are, as it says, generally set out in the Book of Common Prayer, as authorized by their several churches, national churches. The emphasis on generally and as authorized is crucial. There is only an indicative or suggestive authority to be found, it says, in the Book of Common Prayer, and that book can be changed without losing Anglican definition. It's therefore not in itself as a fixed document crucial to identity. Fourth, it is by nature neither centralizing nor uniform in culture or style. The colonial elements of its origins are to be adapted and transformed by the local culture. This lies at the heart of our communion. Fifth, the Anglican Communion has a common focus in the office of the Archbishop of the most ancient metropolitical see in our communion. The practical test of membership is being in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Bishops are, of course, absolutely necessary to that communion. Sixth, neither the Archbishop of Canterbury nor the Lambeth Conference is given authority to rule the communion. The Common Council of Bishops, meeting in the Lambeth Conference, is intended to guide the life of the communion. Its bonds are those of mutual loyalty and committed fellowship. And other instruments, so-called, have been added to this, including a primates meeting, an international primates meeting, and in England, an Archbishop's Council. All that I've just outlined suggests a further characteristic of Anglicanism which synchronizes well with some of the history that I've been repeating. It is inherently conciliar. The Anglican Communion, with its Lambeth Conference, the Consultative Council, the Primates Meeting, and the structures of synodical government, is a striking example of the conciliar ecclesiology which failed in the Roman Church and is still at issue there. Pope Francis's experiment in synodality is an attempt to revive it, as there was discussed this morning on the wonderful podcast, God Forbid. There's an interesting discussion there about this papacy and the previous two, and how, in particular, Pope Benedict was very much vertical, top-down and up, and Francis is very much horizontal and about encounter. Worth listening to that podcast if you get a chance, God forbid. The Anglican Communion, therefore, is conciliar. Appeal to conciliarity allows a coherent understanding of how the Church of England, or the Anglican Communion, can be at once Catholic and not a system, not just a network. But it will only work if we attend to the meaning and membership of the conciliar instruments, and this will always primarily comprise bishops. Bishops keep cropping up throughout this history, don't they? They are, as ever, a source of argument in the Church. Throughout Christian history, popes have repeatedly tried to diminish the significance of bishops. They are, some would say these days, really papal curates, though the Pope tries very hard now to devolve power to local bishops. And of course, in our tradition, they have in fact more power than Roman bishops, and especially in the communion, more direct authority. Denominations, of course, in the Protestant side of things, have tried to be rid of them, but they always seem somehow or other to bounce back, and they seem to be absolutely necessary for a successful ecumenical project. They are in the bloodstream of the body of Christ. The Lambeth Quadrilateral insists that bishops are crucial to our continuity with the undivided Church, part of the essence of what the Church is. So, to the next weeks. The first two pillars of the Quadrilateral are the Scriptures and the Creeds, and in the next 2 weeks I will deal with those two elements, somewhat overlapping over the 2 Sundays, and seek to show how they are intimately and innately related strands of the tradition of the Church at large, and Anglicanism in particular. In week 4 I'll be dealing with Anglican sacramental theology, which is point C in the Quadrilateral, and in the 5th and last talk I will focus on episcopacy as a guarantee of the Church. And I've left you with just a quote that came out of reading Pope Francis' autobiography, just to remind us that we don't get stuck in dry academic things as we think about all of this and consider our faith in this season. Tradition is not the worship of ashes, it is the preservation of fire. Gustav Mahler, quoted by Pope Francis. That's all I have to say today. Is anyone wanting to ask any questions?
What was the problem with the bishop in Rome that the Church of Scotland had to
You're talking about when the Scottish Episcopal Church... The Scottish Episcopal Church was separate from the Church of England. The established church in Scotland is the Presbyterian Church, but there were people who retained allegiance to bishops and to the old ways. There was no problem with Rome about that. That was an Anglican thing. The Anglicans in Scotland wanted to remain Anglican and have bishops. And so they had to build new churches and separate themselves from the Presbyterians. And then when the American church, the Anglicans in America, wanted to form their own separate church, they looked to Scotland to gain their bishops because the Church of England wouldn't consecrate any.
I seem to remember that with the Reformation in America, the emphasis was on preaching. And if you could preach for 2 hours, you got the job.
Well, that was also true in quite a lot of Anglican churches in that period. I inherited in Berkhamsted, where I was before my last job, a book of sermons from a previous rector from the 18th century, and all of them would have taken nearly 2 hours to deliver. Anyway, that's a history we don't need to repeat. Does anyone want to ask anything else?
Michael, I'm wondering whether how the different polities of the different national churches, how that had any effect or impact on the understanding, as Catholic Anglicans, what that means. You may deal with it.
Well, I will deal with some of that later on. There are differences, of course, and not least because some parts of the communion developed synodical governance earlier than England. England has only had a general synod for about 60 years, I think, whereas Australia, I think, was one of the first places to develop this system of governance. And that came out of the Australian bishops starting to worry about whether or not they were under the direct jurisdiction of England or not. But that's another story. Anyone else?
Thank you, Father Michael. I'm just wondering if you could expand further on the chaplaincy. You describe the Church of England outside of England, wherever it happened to show up next, as a kind of a chaplaincy, which is not my understanding of the Australian Church as such at all. Whether you could kind of give some further definition of that.
I'll try. I mean, that's a bit of a shorthand. You'll know that the Diocese of Europe entirely comes out of chaplaincies to Anglican diplomatic posts generally. But, I mean, the first Anglican service in Australia was held by Richard Johnson in Sydney. He was the chaplain to the First Fleet and the governor. And in essence, wherever we went outside of England, the first people to hold Anglican services and start setting up Anglican churches were essentially chaplains to the English settlers, and then expanded and created bishoprics and so on. And it took a while, as I'm sure you'll know, for us to have any episcopal oversight in Australia. Our first bishop, Broughton, was the Archdeacon of Calcutta, I think, and we were under him to start with, and then he was sent out to be Bishop of Australia. But yes, he's the only one who was bishop of the whole country and then became Bishop of Sydney, that's right. But, well, we became a national diocese within his tenure, yes. But chaplaincy is, I'm just saying, the model on which the Church of England exported clergy to wherever they went. Yeah. Anyone else?
Father Michael, does that mean we have to stop eating meat on Fridays?
No.
Father Michael, I was wondering, when it comes to, seeing as the Orthodox and the Catholics both had valid bishops who still have valid authority, how do we reconcile that with our bishops and their bishops sharing an area of jurisdiction?
Well, that's one of the messinesses of the church as it now is. And of course, Orthodox churches have done the same sort of thing as we have and have exported jurisdictions overseas. So there's an Orthodox Archbishop of Australia. And then sometimes there are Orthodox churches of different national churches, aren't there, to be found in different countries around the world. Jurisdiction is something that is perhaps less important than communion, I think is the way I'd like to phrase that. And it's something that would only really need to be resolved once we get over the ecumenical boundaries and share communion. Yeah. That sounds like enough for today. All right. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll be with us next week.